In this lesson, we will learn and experiment with 10 different eye-catching watercolour paint techniques. The materials you'll need are a set of watercolours, a large round-tip paintbrush and a small, fine round-tip paintbrush. You'll need 2 white pages in your art sketchbook, a pot of water, a pencil, a round plastic cup, an oil pastel or crayon, a straw, a little piece of plastic wrap or cling film, some tissue paper, a bit of table salt, some PVA glue or masking fluid, and a medium small plant leaf to print with. To start the activity, you'll need to make 10 circles. You can trace around a round plastic cup for this. Make sure that you equally space your circles out, so here I've got 5 on one page and 5 on the other page. To kickstart these techniques, let's begin with wet on dry, which is technique 1. This would be the most obvious one and the one that most people would do first. So I'm just copying a leaf that I gathered from the garden here, and later on we will use the same leaf to make a print with. But for now I'm just dipping my paintbrush into my watercolour set and layering up the colours, different tones of greens. I've got yellow, I've got light green and dark green, and perhaps a little bit of black for some shading as well. Technique 2 is called wet into wet. Here you'll need to wet your paintbrush, and I'm filling up the entire circle with just some water first. Then choose any colour and fill the top half of that circle. Leave a little bit of white space in between the 2 colours, fill the bottom space with a different colour, and then dip your paintbrush into the colour. Start from the lightest colour first, go from left to right and drag the colours into each other so that they blend. Technique 3, tissue absorb. For the third technique, you need to make sure that you lay down a darker colour so that the tissue, when it absorbs the paint, will be enough of a contrast to show up. Fill up the entire circle with that colour that you want, and then simply take a tissue and dab away wherever you want that part of the highlight. For more dramatic effect, I ended up putting 2 more layers of the same colour and then just absorbing away the darkest colour on top. Technique 4, splotch effects. For this technique you need to lay down a base colour, and that colour needs to be fairly watery. After that you need to dip your paintbrush into a colour that you want to contrast that with. So here I used sort of like a mustardy yellow, and then I used a dark blue and a slightly lighter blue. So all I'm doing here to allow the paint to bleed into each other is simply just dabbing the wet paintbrush onto the wet background. This enables the paint to bleed into each other, creating this interesting splotch effect. For the 5th technique, we're going to print some leaves. So I'm just laying down a neutral colour here in the background of the circle, and then I'm going to take the leaves that I collected and I'm going to simply paint, and then I'm going to simply paint on one side of that a colour that I would like to print. So I'm choosing a dark green here. Once you've covered the leaf, simply lay it down and lightly press it onto the paper. You can leave it as that, or you can go around the outside as well of the shape, trying not to move the leaf itself if you can, to create a negative space as well as a positive. For technique 6, we're going to use salt to absorb some of the watercolour that we're first laying down. Lay down any colour and fill up that circle. You must make sure that the colour is nice and watery, that it doesn't dry out too quickly. Before it dries out, you need to take a pinch of salt and just cover the area that you would like the effect. Let that dry, and once it's dried, take a tissue and lightly and loosely just rub away that granulated salt to leave a lovely effect. For technique 7, we're going to experiment with masking fluid or PVA glue. The reason why we're doing 2 here is because it depends, and most people have PVA glue compared to masking fluid. So firstly, with the PVA or Mod Podge, whatever you've got at home, you're simply going to dab a collection of dots on the bottom half of that circle. Let that dry. and then you're going to go in with some masking fluid and do the same sort of thing on the top. However, I'm also adding a few wavy lines here as I wanted to see what the effect would look like. Before adding paint over the top of the masking fluid and PVA, you really need to let that dry for a good 10 to 15 minutes. So while we're letting that dry, and even the salt, I'm going to go on to technique 8, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Calling this splat and tap. This is a really fun technique and gives sort of a playfulness to your work. So for this, I'm using a collection of different colours. The colours must be very watery, and then I'm taking a straw. If you do not have a straw at home, you can roll up a piece of paper, blow through that, and make sure that the lines of your splat travel across the paper in the direction that you want them. Once your paint is dry, you can then flick a paintbrush to create these splattering effects. These are really fun, and you can do that also for the night sky if you wanted, for example, to make some stars. Technique 9 is a very effective one, and here we're going to use contrasting colours. Here I'm drawing a spider's web. I've just used a light peach tone for that, and then I'm going to go in with a black watercolour and just paint directly over the top. Do not worry about the going over the cobweb lines because the oil within the crayon or the oil pastel will resist the water, giving a really nice contrasting effect. Technique 10 is the last technique that we'll be looking at, and we're going to apply cling film to create an interesting texture. The first thing that you need to do is add a nice background colour. I'm just going to go in with a green here, simply because the texture that it looks like once dried almost looks like a leaf. Make sure that the background colour is still watery. Cut out a small amount of plastic wrap or cling film and apply that to the circle over the top. Make sure that you scrunch your cling film in the direction that you want it and let it dry. Now that the masking fluid or white glue has dried, I'm going to then go in with some colour over the top, and I decided to use a rainbow effect. You can use any colour that you like. As you can see, the PVA is resisting, and you can have a lovely sort of pattern that shows up underneath the colour, which is a great effect to have. To enable these colours to merge, I simply dipped a clean brush into some water and then went over them vertically. If you're the type of person that enjoys working on detail, you could take a super fine brush, dip it in white watercolour, and then create that lovely highlight and the veins that you see within the natural leaves. Once technique 10 has dried, carefully peel back the cling film, and this is the effect it should give you. I've saved the best till last. This is the fun part. So now that our masking fluid is nicely dried, I'm going to just pick away at that as soon as possible, and it really just comes away very easily, and it's almost like stretchy elastic, so it's really simple to work with. Once the masking fluid is all taken off, then you need to take a tissue and just erase away at that salt once that's dried, and this is the effect it will look like. And to conclude, let's zoom in on some of these effects that we practiced today.